Hello and welcome back to Veil Noir. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love reading every single one. If you enjoy drifting into dark, chilling tales veiled in noir, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you dare. Relax your mind. Let the outside world fade away. And let's begin. Story 1. One night. That's how long you'll need to spend with him. Mr. Caswell sat behind the desk in his home office, calm in a way that made me feel even less calm. The book he'd handed me was heavy on my lap, open to page 210. Last Rites. The title alone felt like it belonged in a different century. Why? Why me? I asked. My throat was dry, like my body already knew I was agreeing to something I didn't understand. Mr. Serling stood behind me, slightly to my right. I could feel him there without looking, like a shadow you can't shake. When I turned my head, the old chair creaked under me. Sylvie, Mr. Serling started. Sylvia, I corrected automatically. I wasn't trying to be rude. I just hated being called Sylvie. And in that moment, I needed one small thing to be under my control. Sylvie, please, listen to him, Mr. Caswell said, and I didn't correct him. I didn't have the energy to fight both of them at once. Sylvia, you're the only one close enough to us that we can trust, Mr. Serling said. Close enough to... I let out a shaky breath. I barely know you. And if any of this is real, I have no experience doing this. How do you know I won't mess it up? Mr. Caswell leaned forward and held out his hand. He didn't look threatening. He looked tired, like he'd been carrying this fear for decades and was only now admitting he needed help. Sylvie, he said softly, as if I were a child. The less experience, the better. She won't know you. She won't know what you're scared of. She won't know how you work. He paused and his grip tightened just a little around my fingers, grounding me. And if you truly don't believe it, he added, then all that will happen is you spend the night in the same room as a dead body. I stared at him. My mouth opened, and I felt the start of a curse rising in my throat, because that was my reflex when I was cornered. But I swallowed it back. Fine, I said. The word came out flatter than I meant it to. I'll do it. Great, Mr. Serling said quickly, like he'd been holding his breath. His black leather shoes tapped the wood floor as he stepped closer. He put a hand on my shoulder in a way meant to be comforting, but it made my skin tense anyway. It means more to us than you'll ever know, he said. He squeezed my hand, and for a second it felt like he was trying to communicate something he couldn't say out loud. Sylvie, honestly, thank you. You can ask Mia for advice. The fact that Mia knew what her uncle's real work involved and never told me didn't shock me anymore. In the last hour, my brain had run out of space for surprise. I closed the book. The cover thumped shut, heavy and final. I stood up, the chair complaining behind me, and I walked out before either man could change his mind or before I could change mine. Mia was waiting in the hall, biting her nail, something she'd been trying to stop doing since we started college last year. Her eyes flicked to my face, and she read my decision immediately. So, she said, voice careful, what do you want to know? I almost laughed, because there were 100 things. Have you ever seen a dead body? Do you ever get used to the smell of a funeral home? What does it feel like to be locked in a building with someone who isn't alive anymore? But none of those were the right question, and Mia would have heard the fear in all of them. Mia is my closest friend, the kind of friend you don't remember meeting, because they've always been there. She grew up around her uncle, Mr. Caswell, and his funeral home. I grew up around it too, by extension. When we were kids, we spent afternoons there sometimes, because it was where Mia was, and because Mr. Caswell was one of those adults who didn't mind children in his space. Looking back, it probably wasn't an appropriate place for two kids to treat like a second home. But childhood doesn't wait for adults to make things tidy. I didn't know Mr. Serling well at all. For whatever reason, he was never around when Mia and I visited. The few times I'd seen him, he'd felt like a polite stranger. I would have described our relationship as strictly surface level, all small talk and distance until today. This happened in the Massachusetts town where I grew up. It's the kind of small town where you can't take a walk without seeing a former teacher, someone's aunt, the kid who used to sit behind you in 4th grade. It's the kind of place where news doesn't travel fast because of the internet. It travels fast because there's nowhere for it not to go. 2 days ago, when I heard Mr. Cortez had died, I pictured him immediately. He was the older man who sat on the park bench near the cherry trees in spring, letting petals fall onto the open pages of whatever he was reading. I'd noticed Nabokov in his hands once, and Bradbury another time, and Asimov when I was younger, and thought science fiction was a secret club. Occasionally he'd be reading someone I'd just started studying in school, and I'd stop and talk to him because it felt rare to find an adult who wanted to talk to a teenager like their thoughts mattered. Sometimes we talked about Milton, sometimes Rawls, sometimes Bierce, sometimes Parnock. He'd listen with this quiet patience that made me feel smarter than I was, and then he'd say something that rearranged the whole conversation. "Well, Miss Sylvie," he'd said to me not long ago, he always called me that with a half-smile, "I've lived about 12 lives. I'm pretty sure God forgot to take me on the seas. He can only forget so many times." That was one of the last things he ever said to me. We'd been talking, half seriously, about fate and choice, and whether you can ever really outrun who you are. I guess he'd stayed in one place a little too long. Now he was lying in a coffin in Mr. Caswell's funeral home. Earlier that day, Mr. Caswell had asked me to come over. The request had sounded normal at first, serious, but not strange. Then Mr. Serling joined us, and the tone changed. They asked me for a favor, and the word favor didn't fit what they were describing. They wanted me to spend one night with Mr. Cortez's body and keep him safe. Safe from what exactly? A curse. I'd grown up in Massachusetts, so the word witch trials always brought Salem to mind in the lazy, touristy way history gets flattened. But Mr. Caswell told me Salem wasn't the only town that did it. Our town had hosted its own trial. Our town had done its own damage and then buried it. According to Mr. Caswell, one of his ancestors had prosecuted. There isn't a good word for it because the whole process was ugly. One of those trials. The accused was a young woman named Cassandra. Before she was hanged with a noose made of corded greenbrier vine, she called on whatever power she had, or whatever she believed she had, and cursed the town's dead. They wouldn't be allowed to rest. There would only be suffering. When someone died in town, Cassandra came 3 nights later. If no one stopped her, she took what was left of them, their mind, their consciousness, their awareness, and dragged it somewhere that wasn't here. A place of endless pain, meant as repayment for the pain she'd endured before, during, and after her trial. It sounded impossible. It sounded like a campfire story that had been repeated until it grew teeth. But Mr. Caswell and Mr. Serling didn't look like men telling a story. They looked like men asking for help because they'd run out of options. The book in my lap was their proof, or at least their tradition. It was a book of instructions, folklore, and town history. The last rites were rules meant to keep Cassandra away until morning, rules passed down through the people who felt responsible and the people who felt hunted. At the start of the conversation, I didn't believe them. Then I watched them. The seriousness, the desperation, the way Mr. Serling's hands shook slightly when he thought I wasn't looking, the way Mr. Caswell kept swallowing like his throat hurt. And I realized something. Even if they were wrong, even if it was all superstition and fear, they believed it enough to be terrified. So I agreed to try. By the time the sun started dropping, everything was arranged. Mr. Cortez's coffin was moved out of the main funeral home into a small ceremonial building on the property. It was separate, older, used for certain services when they wanted privacy. The east-facing wall held a large stained glass window, dark now, waiting for morning. His coffin lay in the center of the room on what looked like a symbolic shrine. Wooden platform, cloth draped neatly, small items arranged with care. Halogen bulbs hung from the ceiling, too bright and too modern for the room's age. Around the walls stood tall candelabras, the gold metal shafts streaked with wax that had melted and hardened again over years of use. I stood near the coffin and tried to remember Mr. Cortez as a person instead of a body. Of Mr. Caswell's ancestors' first disobedience, I murmured mostly to myself, and the fruit of that forbidden curse, whose mortal touch brought her into the world. It was Paradise Lost, a line I twisted into something that fit this moment. Mr. Cortez and I had talked about that book more than once, about blame and punishment and how people justify cruelty by calling it justice. He didn't respond, obviously. The silence in that room felt thick and heavy, like cloth. I cracked open one of 3 energy drinks I'd brought and set it on the altar at the head of the shrine. Next to it was a lighter. I picked it up and walked clockwise around the room, lighting the candles one by one. The flames caught and steadied, and the air filled with that mix of wax and smoke and something sweet. When I finished the circle, I returned the lighter to the altar. Then I sat down in a chair positioned to the left of the shrine, book open again on my lap, trying to look like someone who knew what they were doing. The tactics in the book were meant to repel Cassandra, but almost none of them were permanent, not solutions, delays. If I saw Cassandra, I was supposed to start with Caswell's apology, a formal prayer addressed to Cassandra herself. It was written in a voice that tried to sound humble enough to matter. Remorse, acknowledgement, pleading. According to the book, it worked sometimes. The visitations weren't identical each time. So much time had passed that Cassandra didn't always remember details. Sometimes reminding her of her death and the wrongness of it was enough to confuse her, slow her, push her back. If the apology failed, I was supposed to use jasmine. There was a vial of dried jasmine petals in the altar cabinet. The instructions said to crush them in my hands, rub the residue into my skin, then light a small fire in a metal bucket and throw the remaining petals into it. The smoke would repel her for a moment, not forever, just long enough to interrupt whatever she was doing. And then, if the jasmine didn't work, Cassandra would turn her attention toward me. That was why I had to be alone. Cassandra fed on the living to gain strength. If there were 2 or 3 people in the room, she'd have enough energy to resist them, even to overpower them. One person was a target, but it was also a limitation, a balance of risk. It was a miserable balance. On top of everything else, the ritual required clothing. I was wearing a heavy, old-fashioned dress in a pale yellow, with a tight corset that made it hard to breathe deeply. It was symbolic, Mia had told me, while she braided my hair and tightened the laces with practiced hands. She'd pinned a hibiscus flower on the left side of my hair like it was a wedding. I'd felt ridiculous looking at myself in the mirror afterward, dressed like someone from the 1800s, then immediately checking my phone because my brain didn't know how to exist without normal habits. I sat there in that ceremonial building, candlelight flickering around a dead man, scrolling social media, and sipping an energy drink. Time passed. Too much time. My anxiety rose and fell in waves. Nothing happened. When I finished my first energy drink, I started wondering if Mr. Caswell and Mr. Serling had been wrong, if they'd built their lives around a story that had grown too large. I almost let myself relax. That was when a cold hand settled lightly on my bare shoulder. I jerked so hard the chair scraped the floor. My heart slammed against my ribs. I spun around, already halfway to a scream. She stood behind me like she'd always been there. Cassandra looked at me with a curious expression, almost mild. She was tall. My eyes only reached her collarbone. Her skin, face, and arms was pale in a way that didn't look like makeup. It looked like she'd been drained. She wore a long white dress, simple and old-fashioned, and black shoes peeked out beneath the hem. Her hair was long and black, spilling down on both sides of her face like ink. On top of her head sat a woven crown of flowers with purplish-blue petals, the only color on her body, the only sign of life. She stared at my face for a moment like she was deciding what I was. Then her gaze drifted past me to the coffin. Something changed in her expression. Focus, determination, like she'd remembered why she'd come. She raised her right arm and started moving across the floor. She didn't walk. She didn't run. She didn't float in a theatrical way either. She glided. The movement was smooth and wrong, as if the floor was pulling her forward. I stumbled backward to the altar and grabbed the small folded paper Mr. Caswell had prepared. My fingers shook so badly, I almost tore it. "Cassandra!" I shouted. My voice cracked loud in the room's stillness. "Cassandra, robbed of innocence, of liberty, and of life, cease your insatiable battle. What Caswell thought of as justice we now know to be the pinnacle of injustice. Your death opened a debt which the families of your murderers have paid several times over. We humbly beg you to show us mercy in the absence of ours." It is only yourself that keeps you from rest. The words poured out in a rush, and as I spoke, I realized how much the room had been swallowing sound until she arrived. Now my voice bounced and echoed and sounded like someone else yelling through my mouth. Cassandra turned her head slightly toward me. "Bold," she said. One word, clear as a bell, and it filled the hall. The apology didn't work. She turned back to Mr. Cortez and began muttering something under her breath. An incantation, maybe, or simply a habit. I didn't know. The book said the process of taking the dead took time. I had a window, but it felt like a thin one. I yanked open the altar cabinet and pulled out the metal bucket, paper, and the vial of jasmine petals. My hands were clumsy with panic. I spilled some of the petals on the altar and didn't even stop to pick them up. I crushed the jasmine in my palms until my skin felt oily and gritty, then dropped the rest into the bucket with the paper. I lit a piece of paper and tossed it in. A light haze rose from the bucket. The scent of jasmine spread quickly, sharp and sweet. Cassandra reacted instantly. She recoiled as if the air had slapped her. Her body shuddered, and then she sank down through the floor like the wood had turned to water beneath her. My legs went weak. "What the fuck?" I whispered, and it wasn't even fear anymore. It was stunned disbelief. Any remaining doubt about whether this was real got crushed flat. I tried to catch my breath, leaning back into the chair like my bones had turned to rubber. Then I looked to my left. A pale hand was rising out of the ground near one of the candelabras. Slowly, Cassandra lifted herself back into the room. As she came up, her fingers trailed along the candelabra as if she couldn't help herself. She traced the gold metal, then the hardened wax, then the candle, then the flame itself. She reached out and closed her hand over the wick. When she opened her hand, the candle was dead. She moved to the next one, and the next, smothering flames with casual precision. She didn't blow. She didn't wave her hand. She took the fire away like it was an object she could pocket. The room grew dimmer and dimmer, the shadows thickening at the edges. I stumbled to the altar again and grabbed the vine of greenbrier waiting there, dried and twisted, its thorns still sharp. I hesitated. Putting thorns in your mouth goes against every instinct. But the book was clear about what came next. I forced the vine between my teeth. The thorns bit into the inside of my mouth, small, sharp pains blooming on my tongue and gums. I tasted iron almost immediately. With only the halogen bulbs overhead and a few remaining candles, Cassandra turned fully toward me. She lifted her hand. Even though I was 10 feet away, I felt something shove me. Invisible pressure slammed into my chest, and I went down, falling backward. As I fell, the greenbrier shifted, and the thorns cut the roof of my mouth. Warm blood spread, metallic and thick, and before I hit the floor, my body stopped midair. I hung there, horizontal, suspended like a toy held on a string. My arms and legs wouldn't move. Panic flooded through me in a hot wave, and my muscles strained uselessly against nothing. Cassandra drifted closer. Her hair lifted and flowed as if in water, then dropped onto my face, cold and damp and smelling faintly of earth. She hovered above me, parallel, studying me. The book had called it a death's kiss. It said the last act of her life before the noose tightened had been to kiss Caswell's ancestor. A mark, a curse, something to carry into death with her. Now she repeated it. Her cold hands slid along my cheeks, palms like winter stone. I pushed the greenbrier forward between my lips just as her mouth neared mine. The thorns cut her. She jerked back and screamed. The sound was so raw it didn't feel like a human voice. It felt like pain given a mouth. I dropped to the floor hard. I managed not to hit my head, but pain lit up my lower back and stole my breath. I curled for a second, fighting the urge to vomit, blood still in my mouth. When I looked up, Cassandra had changed. For a moment, she wasn't the pale, beautiful figure in white. She was a decaying body, skin rotted and slipping from bone, her dress tattered and gray with dirt, her flower crown wilted into a dead wreath. She looked like time had caught her and swallowed her. Then, in front of my eyes, she pulled herself back together. It wasn't like watching someone put on makeup. It was like watching reality correct itself. Skin slid back over her skull, the dress stitched closed, her hair smooth, dark and heavy. The flowers regained color. I forced myself to move my legs. When I realized I could still feel them, I pushed myself upright. Cassandra rose too. We stared at each other across the wooden floor like two people who'd just realized they were locked in a room together. Then she screamed again. The scream was so loud it felt like pressure, like my head was going to split. The hanging bulbs overhead burst. Glass rained down. A hot sting sliced my arm, and I cried out, clutching it. The room went dark except for moonlight leaking through the stained glass window. Faint shapes of red and blue lay across the floor, like spilled paint. I crawled to the altar by memory and touch, my palm sliding across the wood, until I found the canister. Salt. My fingers fumbled the lid open, and I poured a circle around myself. The salt hit the floor in a steady stream, bright in the dimness. I threw a handful toward the coffin, too, the way the book instructed, as if I could shield Mr. Cortez with a simple line on the ground. Across the room, Cassandra gathered candles from the candelabras. She moved quickly now, not gliding so much as snapping from one place to another, collecting flames and wax. She piled them together and hovered her hand above them. She muttered something I couldn't understand. The wax melted into a puddle. The puddle caught fire. The far side of the hall ignited, sudden and bright. Heat slapped my face. The light was so intense it made my eyes water. I'd feel sweat forming under the corset, trapped, sticky, and the smell of burning wax turned sickly. And then Cassandra caught fire. She stood in it like it belonged to her. I wanted to run. Every instinct in me screamed to get out while I still could. But I didn't cross the salt. I couldn't. The book had warned that the circle was safety and also a trap. Step out and you become hers. So I did the only thing I could do to keep myself from bolting. I dropped to the floor inside the circle and pressed my palms down as if I could anchor myself. Through the firelight, someone stepped forward. Not Cassandra. A man. He was huge, muscular in an unnatural way, like a statue animated. He had antlers like a deer branching from his head. A blue cloth hung from his shoulders and moved even though there was no wind. His eyes were green and sharp, cutting through the smoke and flame. He walked toward me, slow and deliberate. The fire spread faster. The heat grew worse. The air tasted like smoke and metal. I started crying silently, not because I wanted to, but because my body had decided fear needed an outlet. The man reached the edge of the salt circle. The fire licked right up to the line and stopped. It didn't cross. The man ran at me. I flinched so hard my shoulders hit the floor, certain this was the moment it would break through. He stopped short, right at the salt, and leaned down to look at me. His face was too close. His eyes held me like hooks. I couldn't handle it. I turned my head away, squeezing my eyes shut. He screamed. The scream was different than Cassandra's. It was lower, heavier, like it came from a chest built to carry it. It felt like it vibrated the floorboards. I forced myself to breathe. My hands were behind me, pressing into the salt. I looked down at my fingers, and then, without fully understanding why, I lifted one hand and reached it out past the line into the fire. It didn't burn. The heat was there, the light, the roar, but my skin didn't blister. My hair didn't singe. It was like the fire wasn't fire, not in the way my body expected. I looked back up. The antlered man was gone. The book had said that once Cassandra focused on me, she would create visions. That was why it mattered that she didn't know me, why a stranger was useful. She couldn't build the right nightmare if she didn't know what shaped me. The flames collapsed back toward the wax pile in seconds, as if someone had hit rewind. The puddle hardened. The candles reformed into solid shapes. The room returned to cold darkness and moonlit color. Cassandra stood above me again, replacing the man like he'd never existed. Her face looked different now. Not older, not decayed, but flushed, redder than before, like emotion had finally reached the surface. Tears streamed down her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through her pale skin. She turned away from me. The sounds she made next weren't words. They weren't even coherent. But I understood the feeling in them anyway. Confused despair, deep and endless, as if she'd been trapped in the same moment for centuries and didn't know how to leave it. Very slowly, light began to change. Outside morning was coming. The stained glass window started to catch it, and beams of red and green and blue slid across the floor, growing brighter. Cassandra stared at the colored sunlight like it was a thing she'd forgotten existed. She walked toward me, slower now, almost cautious. She bent down and scooped a handful of salt from the circle, letting it spill through her fingers like sand. Then she threw it at me. It stung my face and got in my hair. I raised an arm to block it, blinking hard. Cassandra laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It wasn't even a cruel one. It sounded like someone hearing a joke too late, like someone breaking under the weight of their own loop. Then she turned away and sank through the floor, disappearing as easily as breath leaving a mouth. The room stayed. The candle stayed. The coffin stayed. The stained glass glowed more and more as the sun rose. I got to my feet slowly, my back aching, my mouth sore from the greenbrier, my arm stinging where the glass had cut me. I walked to the door, my legs trembling like I'd run miles. Before I opened it, I looked back at Mr. Cortez one last time. I don't believe in God. I don't believe I met the devil. What I believed, standing there with salt on my skin and smoke still clinging to my dress, was that I'd met someone human who'd been deeply wronged. Someone who'd been turned into a story and then into a weapon, until she couldn't remember how to be anything else. I opened the door. Sunlight touched my face and my hands, warm and ordinary. And for a second, the world felt normal enough to make me sick. Story 2. My dad used to say journals were windows into the soul. He meant it in a serious way, like he believed a person's true self leaks out through ink. He'd say that when someone writes something down, when they think nobody else is supposed to see it, you get the real version of them. No performance, no mask, just the shape of their mind laid open on paper. I understood what he meant long before I understood why it mattered. When I was 5, I broke into my sister's diary. It was one of those cheap little locked diaries you saw in kids' commercials. The kind that promised privacy but came with a lock that could be popped with a paperclip. I wasn't even trying to steal her secrets. I didn't care who she liked or what she wrote about at school. I was fascinated by her handwriting. To me, the way she moved a pen across paper looked like art. It wasn't just words. It was the way she pressed down and lifted up, how the letters leaned, how some strokes were thick and confident, and others were light, like she was afraid of making a mark. Even at that age, it felt like I was seeing something personal. Like her hand had left behind evidence of who she was when nobody was watching. When she found out, she went straight to my dad. I got scolded hard. I still remember standing there with my stomach twisted, hearing my dad explain why it was wrong. Not in a gentle way either. He was angry. He made it clear that reading someone's private journal was like breaking into their head. I didn't do it again. Not like that. But from that day on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not about snooping, about the writing itself. How every person's handwriting carried a kind of fingerprint. How two people could write the same sentence and still look completely different on the page. How mood and fear and confidence could show up without a person ever saying a word. That obsession followed me into everything. It eventually led me to graphology, the study of handwriting. Most people think it's a novelty, like palm reading, something you see in old magazines. But I didn't see it that way. To me, it was real, practical, almost scientific in the way it demanded attention to detail. It wasn't just the meaning of what someone wrote. It was the way they wrote it, the pressure, the slant, the spacing, the rhythm. A good story still mattered to me, of course, but I learned to crave something else, the shape of a mind showing itself through the hand. All through childhood and then later in college, I found myself surrounded by words and letters like they were living things. Famous authors, historical figures, old letters preserved in books, notes passed in class, essays, badly scribbled homework, perfect cursive from girls who seemed like they were born with a neatness in their bones, and rough, careless writing from boys who wrote like they were trying to get it over with as fast as possible. After a while, I got good at reading the person behind the ink. I could look at handwriting and tell if someone was angry, if they were nervous, if they were rushing, if they were careful because they wanted to be believed. I could sometimes tell if someone was lying, not because handwriting is magic, but because lies change a person's body. They change breathing, tension, pace. Those things show up in the hand. In high school, I even helped teachers catch forged signatures. I'm not proud of that part, but it happened. Teenagers think they can copy a parent's signature by practicing it 10,000 times. They don't realize that a practiced forgery still has the energy of the kid making it. Too stiff, too controlled, too aware. A real signature from an adult who has signed 100 things that week has a different kind of indifference to it. It moves like muscle memory. I graduated early. School felt slow to me, like being trapped in a room where everyone else wanted to move at half speed. I finished what I had to finish, earned honors, and pushed forward as fast as I could. Then I set my sights on Oxford. Maybe that sounds dramatic for a kid from California, but that was my dream. Not because it was Oxford, and people would be impressed. Because I wanted access to the world's writing, archives, studies, old documents, the kind of material that felt like oxygen to me. I begged and pleaded through messages and phone calls. I didn't have connections. I wasn't a legacy. I was just stubborn and obsessed. My dad helped financially. He acted like he was proud, but I could tell part of him was relieved too. I had become the kind of kid who could talk for an hour about how a writer in the 1600s shaped their lowercase g, and how it looked almost identical to a news columnist in 1935. I could see his patience wearing thin when I'd corner him with another comparison, another "isn't this incredible" moment. Still, he paid for the ticket. He hugged me goodbye, and I left the warm California sun for England's gray skies and cold rain. I thought I was going to live inside my passion. I didn't. Not fully. The program was real work, and not all of it was what I wanted. There were other subjects, other requirements, stuff that dragged me away from the pure joy of studying handwriting. And London had its own gravity. People there loved to party, and I got pulled into it more than I expected. Old city lights, late nights, pubs. The feeling of being young and free in a place that didn't care who you used to be. 4 years went by fast. I graduated, but not with the shining praise I'd had in the States. I was smart enough. But my discipline wasn't what it used to be. I could feel it. I knew I didn't have the focus or the money or the willpower to keep going for a master's degree. I also knew I didn't have much of a future in England without connections, and I didn't really have those beyond drinking buddies. I could see where I was headed if I stayed. More temptation, more distractions, more time slipping away while I pretended I was still chasing my dream. So I made myself come home. I wanted my feet back on the ground. I wanted to get back to what I really cared about. Not the parties or the image of being in Oxford, but the quiet pleasure of reading someone's writing and hearing their inner world through it. The stories people couldn't say out loud, but could put on paper. In my last week in my apartment, I stared at my degree like it was both a trophy and a disappointment. I remember thinking, this is the dream I begged for, and it still didn't fix me. That's when I got the email, an interview offer, Boise City Forensics. They were looking for someone who could analyze written evidence, threat letters, statements, anonymous notes, anything that could be tied to a person through handwriting patterns. It wasn't what I used to imagine. It wasn't dusty archives and old love letters from history. It was crime. It was real people, real consequences, real damage. But it was handwriting. It was the one thing I knew I could do better than most. So I packed my life into boxes and came back across the ocean. I took the job and told myself I'd do it for a few years, build experience, maybe move somewhere bigger later. I stayed for nearly 10 years. Some cases were small and dull. Others were the kind that stuck to you. Once I helped expose a political mess. A series of letters had been sent to the mayor, supposedly from himself, written to look like private notes to constituents. Someone wanted to ruin him. The handwriting was close, but the pressure and the rhythm were wrong. It was someone mimicking him, but not well enough. The real giveaway was the way certain letters curled at the end. Habits you don't fake unless you've lived inside someone's hand for years. The self-written letters were actually written by a woman he was having an affair with. She wasn't just trying to embarrass him. There were hints in her writing that she was planning something worse, and those hints helped stop it before it happened. Another case still makes me feel something like relief when I think about it. A family had a daughter who vanished. No sign, no calls. The only thing that came in was a note on a community church pamphlet. Few words, badly disguised. But the handwriting had the same odd spacing and tight lower loops as something she'd written years earlier in a school file. That note led us to the truth. She'd left with a boyfriend, and he'd become abusive. The pamphlet was the only way she could communicate without him watching. Handwriting isn't magic, but it's honest, in a way people aren't always honest with their mouths. Then one July, a heat wave hit Boise so hard the air felt like a hand pressing down. Our building's cooling unit was broken, and by mid-afternoon it was so miserable I sent some people home. Sweat was collecting in places you don't think about. Even the paper felt damp. I was still at my desk near the end of the day trying to finish up an extortion case when Detective Lang showed up at my office door. He looked uncomfortable, half irritated, half curious. He tugged at his collar like he was trying to peel it off his neck. "Lang," I said, forcing politeness through the heat. "How are you today?" He glanced around like he'd walked into an oven. "I thought I was coming in for some nice air," he said. "But it's worse in here. Why haven't you closed up yet?" I shut my work laptop and wiped sweat from my forehead. "I couldn't leave yet. Everyone else is gone, and I had to make sure this extortion case is looked into. From what I can tell, Detective Pastel didn't find the right man." Lang shrugged. "Can't nail it every time." He hesitated, then said, "Do you have a minute before I check on ballistics? Could you look at something for me?" I was about to head out, I said, and I meant it. I was exhausted and sticky and ready to go home. But Lang leaned in like he needed this. "I really think this is something one of your fancy types would like." I rolled my eyes and cleared space on my desk. "The director hates overtime," I muttered. "But fine. Show me." Lang set down a book that looked like it had been dragged through hell and back. Black cover, old binding. The smell hit me late, like my brain didn't want to accept it at first. Urine, stale and sharp. The pages looked warped, stained with use and neglect. I stared at it. "Lang, what the hell is this?" He stepped away from my desk and started fiddling with something someone had left on a nearby counter like he couldn't stand still while he talked. "The case was ruled a suicide about a year ago," he said. "Evidence got released. I was on it for a while. This journal was his. I've been reading it, trying to find something that explains why he did it, or something that shows he wasn't himself." He paused and looked out through the glass at the dying sunset, orange and purple on the tall buildings. "What's up?" I asked. Lang swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I don't know exactly what I found in that journal," he said. "But when I first read it, it felt like it was pleading. And it didn't sound like the same homeless guy we kept dealing with downtown. Something was wrong. He turned back to me, eyes narrowed like he was embarrassed to be asking. I want you to look at the handwriting. See if you notice changes, signs something shifted in him. Then quieter. I don't know. Maybe I'm losing it too. Just do me this favor. Please, I'll owe you. That shook me. Lang wasn't the type to sound like that. He was steady, practical, the kind of detective who didn't scare easy. I started to tell him I didn't feel comfortable taking home evidence that smelled like that and hadn't been bagged. But then I flipped open the cover, and the first page stopped me cold. Not because of the words, because of the handwriting. It was the kind that scratched at something deep in me. A hand that didn't just write, it confessed. The letters leaned like they were tired. The pressure was uneven, like his grip kept tightening and loosening with emotion. It was messy in places, but not careless. It was the mess of a man trying to stay upright. January 17th. This is stupid, the entry began, and right away I could hear his voice in it. He wrote about his therapist telling him to write his feelings down. He wrote like he hated the idea, like he felt insulted by it. And then the anger broke and the grief poured out anyway. He wrote about Rachel, his wife, 18 years together, chemo, the last year, watching her fade, watching color leave her eyes, hearing her beg for the pain to stop. The words were rough, not polished, not poetic, but the pain was so clear it didn't need fancy language. I felt myself lean closer without realizing it, like the page was pulling me in. I looked up and saw Lang watching me. He gave a small nod, like he'd seen that exact expression on other people's faces. Thank you, Preston, he said. I owe you one. And I'm going to get out of here. You've got that look in your eye. Just give it back when you're done. I waved him off without thinking, already sinking into the journal like it was a hole in the floor, and I decided to drop through it. The next entries came fast. January 18th. The writer said he was wrong about the journal. Writing helped at first until he realized he couldn't remember Rachel's voice. That discovery hit him like a second death. He called her cell phone just to hear the voicemail. He wrote about how the journal stopped being about letting go and became about holding on. He wrote about balance, a tightrope he couldn't walk. Rachel had told him not to let her death be the reason he stopped living. He wrote that he didn't know how to live when the reason he lived was gone. January 22nd. He watched a childhood movie, The Black Cauldron. He wrote about a date with Rachel, about the two of them laughing and kissing. His memory was warm, almost glowing. He described her eyes like emerald. He wrote like he was trying to rebuild her from details. January 28th. He described going to a grief group. He hated it. Everyone seemed too cheerful, too ready to move on. Then he wrote about something small and brutal. He washed the bed linens, and for the first time, they didn't smell like her anymore. Rose and lavender replaced by clean laundry scent. He rushed to the bathroom to smell her shampoo again like a man drowning. At some point, I realized night had deepened outside my office. The orange light of sunset was gone. The temperature in the building had dropped. The air felt less like heat and more like a slow chill. I gathered my things and drove home through crowded city roads, barely thinking. I missed feeding my cat, Vizier. I didn't even realize until I was halfway to my house. When I got home, Vizier met me with a soft meow, then immediately lost interest the way cats do. I fed him, heated food for myself, ate too fast. Then I sat up in my bedroom like I was preparing for a long night of studying. Lamp on, desk cleared, journal placed in front of me like an altar. The smell didn't bother me anymore. I wanted the writing. I wanted the story. I wanted that feeling of being able to read another person's inner world like it was unfolding live. February 2nd, I saw her today. That line hit me so hard I sat up straighter. The handwriting changed too. It wasn't a different hand, but something in it snapped into a new energy, tighter in some places, rushed in others like the writer had been shocked awake. He wrote that he'd put the house up for sale. He wrote that he was ready to leave. Then he heard knocking, hard, closed fist knocking, loud enough to echo in his teeth. He opened the door and found an elderly black man with a calm voice and a plain accent. The man introduced himself as Clint Hardtack. He claimed he'd just moved in, that the neighbors wouldn't talk about the house, and he wanted to know about his new neighbor. The writer tried to brush him off, said he wouldn't be there long. Then Clint asked about Rachel, not in a casual way, in a way that made the writer stop moving. Clint described her: raven hair, jade eyes, emerald eyes. The writer wrote that his body went cold. He admitted Rachel was his wife. He said she'd passed. Clint acted sorry, almost too sorry. The writer invited him in. They drank tea. They talked about Rachel. The writer started to tell the story of meeting her in high school. That's when the stranger smiled too wide. And then he corrected him, not gently. He told the writer that he hadn't met Rachel in the way he claimed. Clint described something ugly and specific from their past. A moment in a locker room, spying on her through a hole, a stolen chisel, a shameful act the writer had buried. The writer wrote that he attacked Clint in rage and fear, smashing him with a mug. Clint didn't react like a hurt old man. He stood as if nothing happened. The writer screamed, asking what he was. Clint told him he was an eater. Not a predator of bodies, but a thought, an eater of memory. He said forgetting, the daily loss people shrug off, was him. He said sometimes hunger forced him to take bigger bites. And then he offered a deal. He would take a chunk of memories in exchange for something the writer wanted more than anything. One memory of Rachel, fully lived again. Before the writer could even throw him out, he smelled rose and lavender. He heard Rachel's footsteps. He saw her, alive, smiling, speaking to him like it was an ordinary day. The writer described the memory like he was trapped inside it, like he could feel happiness, but couldn't change the script. They went to her dad's birthday dinner. It was perfect. Then it snapped away. He was back in his living room with Clint, who asked what he wanted next. The writer wrote 2 words, everything. He wanted everything. I turned the page and noticed the handwriting shift again. Tiny changes. The shape of certain letters wasn't consistent. The way he made his I's and D's started to drift. It looked like someone losing motor habits, but it also looked like someone losing themselves. February 19th. The writer said he'd lost the journal. And now that he was reading it again, he understood why. He didn't remember the day with Clint. He didn't remember listing the house. His therapist asked about the journal, and he denied it existed. He wondered if he was going crazy. He begged in his own way to see Rachel again. February 27th. He wrote that it came again, and he kept losing the journal. He believed the thing was always watching him. He said it couldn't be harmed and didn't want to hurt him, but it wanted to eat, and he kept letting it in because the trade was unbearable and irresistible. This time, the thing came as a small Asian girl selling Girl Scout cookies. The writer let it in. He admitted he couldn't stop himself. He described being shown a memory of Rachel again, his first kiss. But then he realized parts of his earlier entries had been wrong. Rachel didn't love the Black Cauldron. She barely knew it. She just liked him enough to spend time with him. The memory he treasured had been rewritten inside him. He didn't care. He wrote about the bliss of being inside the memory anyway, like being high and not wanting to come down. At some point, I blinked and realized I wasn't in my bedroom anymore. I was back at my desk at work. Detective Lang was standing in front of me, snapping his fingers lightly like you do when someone zones out. "Hey, Preston." "Earth to Preston." I stared at him like I'd been pulled out of deep water. "Sorry," I said. "This journal is intense." Lang raised an eyebrow. "You okay? I told Pastel what you said the other night. He said you never got to him." I frowned. "That's odd. I could have sworn I told Pastel." Lang shrugged. "No skin off my teeth. You get the psychedelic parts?" He tapped the journal and gave a half smile like he was trying to keep it casual. I forced a laugh. "Yeah, it's wild." "You think he was on drugs?" Lang patted his chest. "I like to think so. Makes me feel better." He reached for the journal, but my hand tightened around it without me meaning to. I wanted more. I needed to see how it ended. I told him I wanted to check if it looked like dementia or Alzheimer's, because the later handwriting could show that. Lang pulled his hand back and waved goodbye, leaving. I sat there, staring at the journal, and I realized something that made my stomach twist. Why couldn't I remember coming to work that morning? I brushed it aside and kept reading. March 4th. The writer said it was getting harder to remember basic things. Showering, paying the mortgage, checking mail. He wrote about the thing coming back and how he grabbed it and dragged it inside. Only it wasn't the thing. It was the mailman. Police got called. He apologized. Then he wrote something that made my skin prickle. Before the second officer left, the thing looked back at him and smiled. But he only remembered letting one officer inside. He described it as cutting and stitching his memories together, fast and ugly, like it was playing with him, rearranging his reality. He wrote that he didn't tell it to go away. He begged it, silently, to give him more. And it did. He wrote that it didn't even take memories of itself away anymore, because it didn't need to hide. He wanted more, and it always obliged. Then the writing shifted again, and he described being taken into memories of Rachel's diagnosis, and intimate nights, and fear, and love. Even in the middle of his terror, he was addicted to seeing her. The next section didn't read like a normal journal entry anymore. It read like someone collapsing. He wrote about waking from a cold sweat and realizing he wasn't reading the journal anymore. He was dreaming about it. He could see the handwriting in his mind, bleeding and dancing, etching itself into him. He wrote that it wasn't just intrigue now. Something was wrong with him, and it was tied to the journal. But he didn't dare throw it away. Then he wrote about stepping on something wet and cold in the dark. He turned on the light and saw his cat, Vizier, dead, rotting. He realized he hadn't fed him in weeks, or maybe longer. He didn't know where he'd been. He didn't even know if it was his home. The panic in his handwriting was obvious. The lines tilted. The pressure spiked. He wrote about grabbing the journal and racing through the city, breaking every driving law except hitting someone. He wrote about peeling into a parking lot and searching for Lang, blaming Lang for bringing this thing to him. He described trying to open the front door with his badge, and it wouldn't work. He threw the badge down. Then he saw Detective Pastel standing to the side, watching. He started apologizing to Pastel about an extortion case. He couldn't remember his laptop, couldn't remember where his files were. Pastel asked him if he knew where he was. The writer cursed at him, insisting he was at work. Pastel pulled a taser. Then Pastel told him to look around slowly and say where he was. The writer realized he was on a college campus, surrounded by students. He caught his reflection in a window, unshaven, ragged, filthy, hollow-eyed. He didn't recognize himself. Pastel put hands on him gently and asked again where he was. The writer started crying. He said he'd been looking for someone named Lang. Pastel handed him the journal and told him the truth. There was no Detective Lang. They had never worked with anyone named Lang. They'd talked about this weeks ago when the writer caused a scene at the office. The writer had been sent to get checked out and never came back. Then Pastel told him the diagnosis: early onset dementia and Alzheimer's. The writer described being guided home like a ghost, half aware, clinging to the journal. He didn't remember what happened next. He only knew he was being sent somewhere to be cared for, and he wanted to finish reading the journal before his mind collapsed completely. March 12th. He wrote that he couldn't track days anymore. He wrote about peeing in an alley behind a dive bar, about not eating, about chasing the thing through town, about mistaking a kid for it, and running from angry parents, about breaking into a house to find it. Then the writing spiraled. He wrote that he thought he killed someone. Blood on him, hands aching like he'd been smashing them into something hard. Bone, maybe. He said he needed to find it, then simply April. He wrote that it was warmer, so it must be April. He wrote that the thing was everywhere, eating him more and more, and the worst part was that Rachel was all he had left. He couldn't remember if he ate, but he could describe their wedding day perfectly. He could remember a dog they once had. He wrote like his mind was becoming a room with only one picture left on the wall. He wrote that the thing was looking at him now. He begged it not to take her, at least. It didn't speak. Maybe it never spoke. Maybe he never even let it in. Maybe it had always been there, because forgetting is always there. Then he wrote about the last memory it gave him. Christmas Eve, snow, rushing into the hospital, the same nurse's desk, the same warm, sanitized smell. He wrote that they dropped their gaze and said the words he knew were coming. Then he wrote something terrifying. He knew the words and forgot them at the same time. Rachel had died. He wrote about blaming himself for being late, about wanting only one thing, her memory. Then the memory ended, and he had to check the page to remember her name. Rachel? He forgot her name. Goodbye, he wrote. I sat there shaking, the journal heavy in my hands. And then the voice in the writing changed, like the journal had switched owners, like someone else had picked it up and started scribbling in the margins of the same nightmare. The new writer sounded like me. Not exactly, but close enough to make my stomach flip. He wrote about finding the journal and thinking, what the hell, what more could it hurt? He wrote that he was messed up and all he could do was write this down and hear about this guy's strange trip. Then he wrote that the thing was here. He wrote that he wanted more too. He wrote that maybe it could show him his mom and dad again. He wrote that maybe it could take his name. He wrote, Lang, I think it was. I dropped the journal onto the floor. My orderly came in a little while later, carrying food. The orderly picked up the journal and set it on the bedside table, like it was a normal book, like it belonged there. I looked around, confused. Where was I again? A psychiatric care facility, my mind supplied, slow and uncertain. The place where the lost go. A TV played in front of me. The Twilight Zone. I tried to speak to the orderly, because talking to staff can be the only thing that makes the day feel real. My voice sounded close to mine, but older. Maybe I was older. Maybe that's how old I was now and couldn't remember it. I pointed at the TV and said, this was my dad's favorite. I don't want to spoil it, but it turns out the aliens are on a hill outside the city watching them. It's a classic. The orderly chuckled, a deep, easy laugh. Yeah, he said. I know this one, Mr. Preston. Probably better than you do. Something in me tightened. I looked up at him, pale skin, red hair, not the man who usually brought my food. Who are you? I asked. You're not Haroon. Where's my usual guy? The man leaned closer, and his voice slid into my ear like it already lived there. The day you watched this with your dad, he said, he told you that you were going to Oxford. Wouldn't that be nice to see again? He paused like he was letting my hunger rise. How about it, Mr. Preston? He whispered. You want another go? And I understood, in a way that made me feel hollow, that I was feeding it. Maybe I'd always been feeding it. Maybe everyone does. Maybe that's what forgetting is. Something taking its share, day after day, little bites that don't matter until suddenly you look down and realize the plate is almost empty. I stared at the journal on the bedside table. I stared at the man who wasn't a man. I couldn't remember how I got here. I couldn't remember what day it was. But I could remember the feeling of wanting the past, wanting people back, wanting one more perfect moment, even if it cost me everything else. And the truth that hit me hardest was simple and cruel. The thing didn't need to chase anyone. It didn't need to force its way in. It only had to offer you what you missed most. Because most of us would trade anything for one more memory that feels like home, even if we can't remember later that we made the trade at all. Story 3. I first visited the field of gazebos 7 years ago after a day that felt exactly like every other day I'd survived. School was the same routine of being watched and judged and targeted. Bullies followed me through hallways like they had a schedule. Teachers either didn't notice or pretended they didn't. I didn't have a real friend, no one who looked for me, no one who saved a seat, no one who would have picked me first on purpose. I got used to walking by myself because walking by yourself hurts less than walking with people who don't want you there. Home wasn't better. It was quieter in some ways, louder in others. My mother was usually wrapped up in whatever world she'd chosen for herself that day, and I learned not to expect comfort from her. I'd come in, say hello, and she'd give me something that barely counted as a response. If I tried to ask for anything, a ride, help with homework, even just attention, I had to measure every word. One wrong tone, and she'd snap at me. One wrong phrase, and she'd lash out. She never hit me, but sometimes I almost wish she had, because bruises make sense. Bruises are simple. Bruises are proof. What she did was less visible and harder to explain. My dad tried. He worked all day and came home exhausted, but he still did the things my mother neglected. Made dinner, cleaned up, checked in on me when he remembered, fixed whatever broke. He did what he could, and I could see how much it cost him. That made me stop asking him for things too, because I didn't want to be another weight on his back. I lay in bed at night listening to their fights through the walls, learning the sound of anger in a voice, the sound of someone trying not to cry, the sound of a door closing with just enough force to mean something. So that afternoon, I did what I always did. I went to my room and told my mother I had homework. I shut the door and climbed onto my bed, curling around my giant possum-stuffed animal like it was the only thing in the house that couldn't change its mind about me. I closed my eyes and tried to clear my thoughts. The TV in the other room blurred into a muffled noise. I focused on my breathing. I tried to imagine a place where nothing could reach me. And then my mind did something it had never done before. Without opening my eyes, I felt like my bed lifted. Not literally, not in the way that would make the floor drop away, but in the strange, weightless way you feel right before sleep. It was like my body stayed on the mattress, while my awareness floated upward, passing through ceiling and roof like they weren't real, rising into an endless white. I felt my blanket under me. I felt a breeze brush my skin. Then my imagination, my escape, my coping mechanism, dropped me into the middle of a field. I opened my eyes and stared. Dozens of gazebos stood in a wide ring around me, perfectly spaced from each other like someone had measured the distance with a ruler. They were all round, but none of them were identical. Some were painted bright colors. Some were plain wood. Some were covered in vines. Some had carved posts or strange patterns in the railings. They looked like a collection gathered from 100 different parks and placed together in one impossible place. The grass was shortcut and flawless, green in a way that looked almost artificial. Not a rock, not a bare patch, not a single weed. White carnations bloomed in small clusters, like pale islands in a sea of green. They reminded me of the carnations my dad had planted for me at home when I was younger, when he still had the energy to believe little beautiful things could fix big, ugly ones. I turned slowly, taking it in, and my eyes caught on one gazebo in particular. It was surrounded by carnations more thickly than the others, like the flowers had chosen it. Something about it hit me with a strange sense of recognition. Not, I've seen this before, but I belong here. Like I'd spent my whole life under its roof and just forgotten. "Hey there," a bright voice said behind me, cheerful enough to make my heart jump. "Where'd you come from?" I spun around and yelped. A figure stood a few feet away, towering so high I had to crane my neck. I was already one of the shortest kids in my class, but even the tallest boy would have looked small next to this thing. It wore brown, rough-looking overalls that hung down to bare feet. Its skin was slate gray, like garden stones after rain. It wasn't just tall, it was big, broad in the shoulders and thick in the arms, built like something designed to lift heavy things without effort. Its face was smooth, almost too smooth, with a tiny nose, a wide mouth, and large glassy eyes that reminded me of the old paintings my grandmother kept in her living room, faces that looked kind and eerie at the same time. Its hair matched its skin, gray and wild, spilling down its back in curling locks. It played with the curls between its fingers while it watched me. Hi, I managed, my voice shaking. I've never seen a human in the field before, it said, rocking back and forth on its heels like it couldn't contain its excitement. I'm Wotayatai. See, wanna play? I stared, trying to decide whether to run or laugh or wake up. The field felt too crisp to be a dream. I could smell the grass. I could feel the breeze. I could hear nothing else. No traffic, no distant lawnmowers, no birds. Just the soft hush of wind and the weight of quiet. You want to play with me? I asked, because that was the part my mind snagged on. But no one ever wants to play with me. They think I'm weird. Or they say mean things about my parents. You're weird in the best way, Watayatai said, beaming. And I like you just the way you are. Then it opened its arms and pulled me in. The hug was massive, warm, and careful, as if it knew I might break. It pressed me against its chest like a teddy bear that had come to life, huge and soft and safe. I'd imagined hugs like that before, the kind where you can stop holding yourself up for a minute because someone else is holding you. Even if this was just inside my head, my body reacted like it was real. My shoulders loosened. My breath steadied. For a second, I felt something I almost didn't recognize. I felt wanted. While it hugged me, I glanced toward the grass and noticed a single pastel rhododendron peeking up among the carnations. The color looked wrong in a way that caught my attention, but by the time the hug ended and I looked again, it was gone. It didn't matter. Not then. Wotayatai suggested we play tag. I said yes so quickly I didn't even think about it. The rules were simple. I had to run from the gazebo surrounded by carnations to a gazebo surrounded by marigolds on the other side of the ring. If I made it there without getting caught, I won. Then Wotayatai would have to run the same path back. She took it easy on me when she was it, but she still caught me most of the time. Whenever she did, she'd scoop me up and crush me in another one of those giant bear hugs, laughing like it was the best part. After that first day, it became my routine. I'd endure school. I'd do my homework and chores as fast as I could. I'd say as little as possible around my mother. I'd try not to make my dad's night harder. Then I'd go to my room, lie down on my bed, and let my mind drift until the white expanse returned and I dropped back into the field. It was always just Wotayatai and me, and it always felt like the only place where I was more than an afterthought. Some days we played games. Some days we walked through the forest that surrounded the field, a forest that felt too neat and too quiet, like it was part of the same carefully held illusion. Sometimes we picked flowers and wove them into clumsy bouquets using long grass as string. I made bundles of carnations because they reminded me of my dad. Wotayatai made bundles of marigolds because she said they were strong. One day, while we sat in the grass, she told me, I come from another dimension. I didn't laugh. In that place, it didn't sound like a joke. This field, she continued, sweeping her huge hand around us, and the forests and mountains around it. It's like a tunnel connecting us. Half these gazebos go to my world, and half go to yours. I looked at the ring again, the neat spacing, the way each gazebo felt like a doorway waiting for the right person. So other girls like me get to come here too? I asked, and my voice was hopeful before I could stop it. The idea that there were others like me, kids who escaped here, kids who had friends like Watayatai, made the loneliness ease a little. Watayatai looked down at the grass. "It's mostly boys," she said quietly. "Mostly boys?" She nodded but wouldn't meet my eyes. "But I wanted another girl to play with," she said. "Someone who could be my best friend after a long day." "That's what I wanted," I admitted. Saying it out loud made it feel pathetic and honest. "Everyone is so mean to me. I don't have anyone." Wotayatai's thick fingers closed around my shoulder, engulfing it. The pressure wasn't painful, but it was heavy, like she was making sure I stayed. "You have me," she said. "I'll be with you forever." She squeezed my shoulder like she was afraid I might disappear. I smiled because in that moment I believed her, and believing her made the world feel bearable. Leaving the field always hurt. I'd open my eyes in my room and the air would feel duller, like color had drained out. My mother's TV would still be going. The house would still be tense. My dad would still be tired. Nothing would be fixed. Over the years, I made a few friends through band and track, but it never felt stable. I wasn't anyone's first choice. I was the extra friend, the one included if there was room. Nobody hated me exactly, but nothing changed if I wasn't there. In the field, it was simple. It was only me and Watayatai, and she made sure I knew I mattered. It also became easier to notice how real it felt. I could smell individual flowers. I could feel the texture of grass. I could sense the cool shade under a gazebo roof. Sometimes I'd come back to my room and still feel the field's breeze on my skin for a few seconds, like my body had trouble deciding which place was real. And sometimes, things slipped in that didn't match the rest. The first time was in the forest during a game of hide-and-seek. I went deeper than usual, determined to win. I'd hit a growth spurt, but I was still much smaller than Watayatai. And she always found me anyway. She was too good, like she could smell me, like she could feel my thoughts moving through the air. I pushed into thicker brambles to try to fool her, and my foot caught on something. I pitched forward and hit the ground hard. It shocked me, because I hadn't chosen to trip. It hadn't been part of the story. It happened like an accident. I even felt the ache in my knee real and sharp. I looked back at what I'd tripped over and saw a shoe. A lone sneaker, larger than mine, with red stripes painted along the side. Mud clung to it. On the inside of the heel, someone had written a name in black marker. Jake Hanlon. I frowned at it, trying to remember if I knew that name. It didn't belong to anyone in my classes. It didn't belong to anyone on the track team. It didn't belong to any kid I could picture. "I'm gonna get you, so you better have..." Wotayatai's voice boomed closer, and then she stomped into the clearing, looming over me. She stopped short when she saw me on the ground. Her face changed. The excited smile slipped into something tighter. "Do you not want to play anymore?" she asked too quickly. We could do something else if you'd like. Who's Jake Hanlon? I asked, picking up the shoe and holding it up to her. For a split second, something flickered in her eyes. Not confusion, recognition, and then irritation, like I'd asked the question I wasn't supposed to. Her hand shot forward and swiped the shoe from me so fast I barely saw it move. Her fingers almost swallowed it. Nobody, she said. Must be one of the others who come here and visit. Lots of other humans come here and have playmates like me. I never see them, I said. Could we ever have a whole group together? The answer came too fast. No. She stared at me like the idea offended her. We keep things separate, she said. Then her expression brightened in an exaggerated way, like she was turning on a light. Don't worry. You don't need anyone else here, do you? You have me, and I'll be your friend forever. Of course, I said, because I didn't want to upset her and because I meant it. But a stubborn part of me still reached for the thought. But we could also have fun with... I just thought of something fun, she cut in, grabbing my hand and hauling me up. Come! It's back in the field. You'll love this. She pulled me along, and I let her, because the shoe had made a strange cold feeling start to grow in my chest, and I wanted it gone. It wasn't until later, back in my room, that I realized I never saw what happened to the shoe. Elementary school ended. Middle school came and went. I grew older, and the field stayed the same, steady and welcoming. Wotayatai grew too, or at least she seemed to. She was always towering over me, always big enough to hide me from everything. I started thinking about whether I could sneak off during recess and go to the field while sitting under a tree, because by then it didn't feel like daydreaming. It felt like traveling. Wotayatai loved hearing about my world. She asked about my classes, my teachers, the books I read, the people I knew. She listened like my life mattered, which made it easier to tell her everything. So I did. I told her about the way my mother talked to my dad when she thought I couldn't hear. I told her about the new pill bottles appearing in their bathroom, all with my mother's name. I told her how long it had been since I'd seen my dad smile like he meant it. I told her how helpless I felt, watching him carry everything while my mother hollowed the house out from the inside. Wotayatai always hugged me afterward. She held me while I cried and told me I was good and smart and important. Her embrace felt warmer than anything in the real world, and every time I came back to my room, my chest felt emptier, like my body missed her grip. I used to wish I could bring my dad into the field. I imagined him laughing under the gazebos, picking flowers, breathing without stress for once. But Wotayatai told me grown-ups couldn't come. Dad's stuck in your world, she said, almost casually. And then high school came, and with it, a day I can't forget. My mother had been on the warpath that morning, and I spent the whole day walking on eggshells, hoping she'd calm down before my dad got home. At school, the group I thought I was part of left me behind again in a small, quiet way that hurt more than a direct insult. I was still the add-on, the tolerated one, never the best friend. By the time I got home, all I wanted was the field. I wanted Wotayatai. I wanted the one place where I didn't have to wonder if I was unwanted. I lay down on my bed, closed my eyes, and let my mind drift. The white expanse returned. Then I dropped into the field, and everything was wrong. Fire covered the world. The forest beyond the gazebos was a blazing inferno. The sky was choked with smoke and ash, so dark it looked like night, with orange light pulsing through it. The air shimmered with heat. The gazebos on the side with the carnations, my side, stood untouched, almost glowing in the firelight. But on the other side of the field, the gazebos were blackened and burning. The gazebo surrounded by marigolds, the one Wotayatai always made me run to, was collapsing in on itself, wood cracking and falling into flame like it was being eaten. Even the flowers were wrong. Where the white carnations should have been, I saw wilting rhododendrons, their colors sickly against the grass. The sight hit me with dread, because I remembered that single rhododendron I'd seen once, the one that disappeared. A low, horrible sound filled the air, a deep rumble that seemed to rise and rise without ever resolving, like an endless note. It pressed against my thoughts. It made my teeth vibrate. My happy place was burning. My escape was dying. I stood at the edge of the fire, shaking, and tried to fix it the way you fix a dream. I tried to imagine rain. I tried to imagine a thundercloud forming and dumping water till the flames went out. Nothing happened. No, I whispered. Why? Just why? I turned away, covering my face with my hands like that could block the sight. I'm sorry you had to see this, a voice said behind me. I spun around. Wotayatai stood there, closer than usual, and for the first time her warm smile was gone. Her overalls looked more worn, darker, and when she moved, I caught a smell like leather and damp earth. What's going on? I asked. I didn't imagine this. What's happening? It's my world, she said, and tears shone in her huge glassy eyes. The grown-ups did something horrible. My home is breaking down. It's unraveling into the void. I could barely make it here. She glanced over her shoulder, and as she did, another gazebo on her side collapsed into flame. That sound, she said, voice trembling. Is it falling apart? She sank to the ground like her legs couldn't hold her anymore, fingers twisting in her own hair the way anxious people do. I don't know what's going to happen to me, she whispered. A sharp ache spread through my chest, immediate and real. I stepped closer and put my hand on her shoulder, copying the way she'd comforted me for years. It's okay, I said, and I meant it. You still have me. Her hand closed around my wrist, thick fingers squeezing. Her grip was stronger than usual, tight enough to make my bones feel small. I do? She whimpered. But you won't want to come back here now. Half the field will be ash. There has to be something I can do, I said. My voice shook with urgency. Please, I'll do anything. A thought I'd had 100 times, a hopeful fantasy, rose up, and this time I spoke it out loud. You can stay with me, I said. In my world. We'll figure out how to get you over, okay? There has to be a way. Whatever it takes, I'll do it. Wotayate's eyes widened. Her grip tightened again, like she was anchoring me. You would do that for me, she asked. You'd let me come to your world? Whatever it takes. Of course, I said. You're my best friend. I don't want to lose you. The low, rumbling sound cut off instantly. The silence that replaced it felt like stepping off a ledge. Then Wotayatai smiled. Not her usual bright, gentle smile. A massive, toothy grin split her face, so wide it looked painful. You said it, she cackled. Before I could pull back, she yanked my hand toward her mouth. Her lips parted, and I saw teeth I had never noticed before. Huge, sharp shapes like blades, like guillotines lined up in rows. They came down. My hand was severed at the wrist. I screamed and stumbled backward, my left arm ending in a smooth stump. There was no blood. It was like my body had turned into a statue and a piece had been snapped off. Yet somehow I could still feel the hand that was no longer attached to me. I felt it being crushed, pummeled, ripped, shredded down to nothing. The pain was so intense my vision blew out white for a moment, and then it vanished, leaving a hollow numbness in its place. "You said you would help me cross over," Wotayatai snapped, her voice no longer playful. She began to rise, and her body shifted as she did. Her overalls split down the middle like fabric tearing under pressure. Her face rippled. Her eyes moved farther apart. Her tiny nose climbed upward. Her mouth widened, and a deep cleft opened down her chin and neck like she was splitting into something else. Inside the open overalls, there was darkness, an impossible void, and within it I saw the glint of countless blade teeth, stacked and waiting. I tried to yank myself back to my bed, to tear myself out of the field the way I always had. I tried to wake up. Nothing happened. Wotayatai laughed. "It might have seemed like pretend at first," she said, voice turning distorted. "But my people have always been good at getting into minds, making it seem like our targets imagined it." Her gaze pinned me. "This place is real," she said. "Just not for your physical body. I let you escape before. But now you've given me permission to take you." I turned and ran. I didn't think. My feet hit the grass, and I ran toward the gazebo surrounded by carnations, because it was the only landmark that felt like safety. Behind me, Wotayate dropped onto all fours. Her limbs hit the ground with heavy impacts that shook the field. The low rumbling sound returned, louder now, buzzing through my bones. "You've been given so many bodies," she growled as she charged after me, voice vicious and hungry. "We're only ever given one." A shadow stretched over me, long and wrong. "But those who are lonely," she continued, "their minds twisting and tricking them. We can connect to you. We can build you a world. We can make you trust us." I ran faster than I thought I could, lungs burning, legs pumping the way they did in track practice. For the first time, every day I'd spent running laps felt like it mattered. "There's only room in your physical form for one soul," she snarled behind me, close enough that I could hear the wet movement of her breathing. "And it would be cruel to just leave yours here." I screamed as I ran, my one remaining hand reaching toward the gazebo ahead. Wotayatai gained on me anyway. Her four legs carried her with terrifying speed. The black void inside her body opened wider, like a flower unfolding, except every petal was a blade. "My siblings settled for male victims," she said, voice slipping between words and that endless rumbling tone. "They've already moved into their new bodies. They're planning how to do to your world what we did to ours." My mind flashed to the shoe. Jake Hanlon. "One was sloppy and left that shoe," Wotayatai growled. "But you still hadn't put it together?" The shadow of tendrils rose ahead of me, flicking and twisting through the smoky sky. I could feel something slimy brush my ankles, testing, reaching. "We had great times together," she said, almost fond, and that was the most horrifying part. "But eventually you stopped pretending with the little piglet you raised for butchering." The gazebo was just a few feet away. "You gave me permission," she howled. "I only exist to hurt and ruin." Now accept your fate and let me take you. I leaped. Slimy things wrapped around my legs, yanking hard, but my fingers hit the cool wood of the gazebo railing. I grabbed and held on with everything I had, and the field snapped away. I shot back into the real world so violently it felt like being thrown. I was in my dad's arms. He was carrying me to the car, face strained with panic, trying to keep me safe while my mother, wild-eyed, laughing, howling, grabbed at him and fought him like she wasn't my mother at all, like she was something wearing her skin. My head spun. The sounds overlapped. My dad's voice, my mother's laughter, my own sobbing. Moments blurred. He shoved me into the back seat, slammed the door, ran around the car, and drove. My mother chased us on foot down the street, laughing, like she thought it was a game. Dad drove to the nearest hospital with both hands white-knuckled on the wheel. He stayed with me every second he could, even as nurses asked questions and doctors checked me, and my dad tried to explain what had happened without sounding insane. All the while, I couldn't move a single finger of my left hand. My left hand was still attached. It still looked normal. But it wouldn't move. It wouldn't respond. It might as well have been dead. After that night, things broke, and then slowly started to reform. Dad took us to my grandmother's house, and she welcomed us without hesitation. My mother was gone from our daily life after that. How, exactly, is complicated and painful. But Dad managed it. We didn't go back to the house the same way. We didn't go back to the old normal. Doctors examined my hand again and again. They tested nerves. They tested muscle response. They scanned and poked and asked me to squeeze their fingers. Nothing. The nerves weren't damaged. The muscles weren't wasting away. Everything looked fine. But I couldn't twitch my pinky. I couldn't flex my thumb. It was like the connection between my brain and my hand had been cut cleanly, even though the flesh remained intact. They recommended physical therapy. I tried for a while, forcing myself to do exercises that made me feel stupid and hopeless. But after months with no change, I stopped. I knew why. My body still had its hand, but my soul didn't. That part of me was gone, eaten and shredded in a place I couldn't reach. Wotayatai hadn't gotten all of me, but she'd gotten enough to leave a dead spot behind. Life got smaller after that, but it got safer. Dad moved us to another part of the city. The place was tighter, quieter, more modest, but the air felt different, lighter. Dad looked like he could breathe again. Making friends at my new school was still hard, but at least home wasn't a battlefield anymore. I still stared at my left hand sometimes, watching it rest there like an object that belonged to someone else. Then one night, while I was working on a sketch for art class, it happened. My left hand was mostly dead weight, but I could position it to hold paper in place. That night, I wedged a pencil between its fingers so I could reach for my eraser with my good hand. The fingers tightened, not from me. They gripped the pencil hard enough that the wood creaked. My eyes snapped to my hand, heart hammering. The fingers adjusted their hold, slow and deliberate, like someone learning how joints work. The wrist lifted slightly. The hand turned toward the paper. I couldn't feel any of it. Not pressure, not movement. My skin might as well have belonged to a mannequin. But the hand moved anyway. And it started writing, the pencil dragging across the page in harsh, urgent strokes. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. I'm sorry I ate your hand. I was so desperate I don't want to be alone again. You're my only friend. Please don't leave me alone. I sat frozen, barely breathing, watching my own hand confess like a trapped animal. She hadn't taken all of me, but the part she had taken, she had brought it here. Please come back. I promise I won't hurt you again. I couldn't stop myself. You're my best friend. I want to be with you forever. I tried to calm myself the way my therapist had taught me. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Name things you can see. Anchor yourself. I looked at my possum stuffed animal across the room. I looked at my grandmother's gray tabby sleeping on my bed, tail flicking once in annoyance at being disturbed. The hand kept writing anyway, fast, messy, angry now, the pencil pressing so hard it nearly tore the paper. Fine, I see how it is. I spend years looking out for you and listening to you. This is how you thank me. How could you do this to me? I thought you were my best friend. My stomach turned. I grabbed the pencil with my good hand and yanked it free, ripping it out of the fingers. I threw it across the room so hard it bounced off the wall. The cat jerked awake and bolted. The dead hand twitched once, like it was angry it had been interrupted, then went still again. A useless piece of flesh. Except now I knew it wasn't useless. From that day on, I kept my left hand bound in a sling, tucked close to my body, hidden and restrained. I told people it was a medical issue. I acted like it hurt. I made excuses. I didn't let anyone touch it. I didn't know how much she could do with just a hand in our world, but I wasn't willing to find out. Sometimes I thought about doing something drastic. Faking a lawnmower accident, claiming I'd smashed it, letting doctors amputate what I already felt I'd lost. But I was still in high school, still trying to survive day to day, and I couldn't bring myself to make the decision yet, so I lived carefully. Then a new transfer student arrived. He was quiet in a way that didn't seem shy. He was cold, alone. His eyes were glassy, like they didn't land on people the way normal eyes do. Most kids avoided him without knowing why. Teachers treated him like he might break. He never approached anyone. He didn't join clubs. He didn't laugh. He didn't get into trouble. But I noticed something early on. He looked at me. Not with curiosity. Not with attraction. Not even with kindness. With recognition. He never came over, never said a word to me in the hall. But every time I felt his stare, my skin crawled, and my bound hand seemed to ache with a feeling I couldn't name. Then one day, a teacher asked him to introduce himself to the class. He stood at the front of the room and faced us. His expression didn't change. His voice was flat, practiced. "Hello," he said. "I'm Jake Hanlon. Story 4. I'll start by saying I'm not a superstitious person. For 11 years, I sat in a Chicago office on the 14th floor and stared at spreadsheets until my eyes felt like they had grit in them. Numbers, deadlines, meetings that could have been emails. The same coffee machine that always burned the bottom of the pot. I was good at my job. I was miserable in my life, and I didn't even realize how miserable until my body started telling on me. When I turned 34, my doctor looked at my chart and said my blood pressure was closer to a 60-year-old's. He didn't say it like a joke. He said it like a warning. Something in me finally clicked. I'd spent my whole adult life treating stress like it was normal, like it was just the price of being responsible. So I did something that made my coworkers act like I'd lost my mind. I quit. I sold my apartment. I bought 40 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, and moved into an old farmhouse that smelled like aged wood and dust and something else I couldn't place. Not mold, not rot, just a sour, buried scent that came and went depending on the weather. The place needed work, but it was solid. It had a porch that looked out over fields and tree lines. It had silence in a way Chicago never did. At night, I could hear the wind move through the hills. I could hear insects. I could hear my own breathing. I told myself I wanted soil. I wanted quiet. I wanted to grow something with my hands instead of moving money around on screens. I wanted to make a life that felt real. For the first 2 weeks, it was exactly what I'd imagined. I woke up early without an alarm. I made coffee and drank it outside while the sun came up over the hills. I worked until my muscles ached in a good way. I fell asleep before 10 like my body had been waiting years for permission to rest. I felt different, lighter, like I'd stepped out of a room that had been too loud for too long. Then I found the marks. They were at the edge of my east field, where the grass thinned into bare ground. At first I thought they were tire tracks or old fence lines. Then I walked closer and realized they were carved into the soil, not scratched, not someone dragged a stick. Carved deep, like someone had pressed a blade into the earth and cut lines with intention. The symbols didn't look like letters. They weren't anything I recognized. They were shapes, repeated in a pattern that felt organized, almost careful. There were curves and angles and little hook-like strokes, all laid out like they were meant to be read by someone. I took photos with my phone and posted them in a local Facebook group for the county. I tried to keep the tone light, like I was just curious. Does anyone recognize these? Found them on my property? People responded the way people do online. A woman said it was probably kids messing around. A man said it could be an old property marker. A few people made jokes about aliens. Nobody sounded worried. I told myself that was a good sign. If locals weren't alarmed, then I didn't need to be either. I went back to work around the farm and tried to forget about it. 3 days later, the corn in that field was 6 inches tall. I'd planted it less than 2 weeks earlier. I'm not a real farmer, but I'm not stupid. I'd done research. I'd read about how long things were supposed to take. I knew what seedlings should look like at that stage, and this wasn't it. Every morning I walked the rows, and every morning the corn was taller than it should have been. Not by a little, by enough that it made my stomach tighten. Plants don't just decide to double their speed because they feel like it. I called the man I'd bought the property from. He answered like he'd been expecting a call about some boring paperwork issue. I asked him if that east field had been treated with anything. Fertilizer, chemicals, something special. Anything that would explain why my corn was growing like it was being pulled upward. He laughed. Not a mean laugh. A tired one, like the question was ridiculous. He told me that field hadn't grown anything in 15 years. I tried to ask what he meant by that. Bad soil? Drainage? Disease? He just repeated it, still half laughing, and said good luck with it. After that, I started hearing it. It wasn't a sound exactly. It was more like the way sound disappeared. At night, I'd sit on the porch with a hoodie on and a mug of tea between my hands, and I'd listen to the usual noise. Crickets, the wind in the trees, distant dogs barking somewhere over the hills. Then the insects would go quiet. Not all at once, like a sudden stop. More like the quiet moved in a line, cutting through the field row by row. A strip of silence drifting through the corn while the sound stayed alive everywhere else. It felt like something walking through the plants at night, and the crickets holding their breath as it passed. I told myself it was an animal, a fox, a coyote, a deer, something that made sense. But it didn't move like an animal. It moved steady, calm, like it had a path. In the third week, I bought a trail camera. I mounted it on a post and aimed it at the east field. I set it to record overnight, thinking I'd catch a deer or maybe kids messing around, and then I'd have an explanation. Something I could point at and say, there. That's what it was. The next morning, I checked the footage, 8 hours of recording. The timestamps were correct. The camera worked fine. But the footage from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. was just white. Not black like night mode failing, not static, not glitchy pixel blocks. White, like a blank screen, like the camera had been staring into a bright light 2 inches away. Except there was no light source in the field when I went out there. No floodlights, no headlights, nothing. I watched it twice, then a third time, rewinding and leaning closer, trying to find any detail inside the whiteness. There was nothing. I took my phone to my neighbor, Earl. Earl is 67 and has been farming in Harlan County his whole life. The kind of man who moves slowly but never seems weak. He has hands that look like they were built for hard work and never got to retire. He didn't say much when I showed him. He just watched the footage with that long, still attention older people have, like they're not in a hurry to fill silence with words. When it hit the white section, he didn't flinch. He didn't ask questions. He didn't look confused. He just stared at it until the timestamp ticked past 4 and the picture came back. Then he handed my phone back. Plant something else in that field, he said. I laughed a little because I didn't know what else to do. Why? Earl looked past me toward the tree line like he was checking something out there. Some ground remembers thing, he said. I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. He just walked back toward his house, leaving me standing there holding my phone like it had become heavier. By the 4th week, the field didn't feel like part of my property anymore. It felt like a place I was borrowing, a place that tolerated me during the day and belonged to something else at night. On a Tuesday morning, I walked out there and found my dog at the edge of the east field. She wasn't moving. At first, my brain wouldn't accept it. I stood there and called her name like she was just sleeping. I kept expecting her tail to thump, her head to lift, her eyes to blink. Nothing. I ran to her and dropped to my knees. The cold went right through my jeans. I touched her fur and felt stiffness that made my throat close. I don't remember making a sound. I think I didn't, which scares me now more than if I'd screamed. I carried her back to the house and laid her on the porch because I couldn't stand to bring her inside yet. Then I went back out, half angry, half numb, trying to look for tracks or signs of an animal attack or anything that could turn this into a normal kind of tragedy. That's when I found the others. Not all at once. Throughout the day, as the sun moved across the sky, I kept finding them in the field. 3 rabbits, 2 birds, a deer, all dead. All arranged in a perfect circle around a single spot near the center of the east field. They weren't scattered. They weren't dragged. They weren't partly eaten. They were placed like someone had taken time and care with it. Every animal was facing outward from the center, like they were guarding something or presenting it. I stood there a long time, cold sweat under my shirt, even though the air was chilly. I kept turning slowly, counting them again, checking the spacing, trying to make the circle less real by proving it was messy or accidental. It wasn't. I called County Animal Control because I didn't know who else to call. They came out with a clipboard and bored look, walked around the circle, took notes, and said it was probably coyotes. They said it like that ended the story. I didn't argue because what was I supposed to say? Coyotes don't do this. Coyotes don't make neat circles. Coyotes don't arrange a deer and small animals like a display. After they left, I stayed there by myself and looked at the center point, the way you look at a spot on the floor after you drop glass. Like it might cut you if you step wrong. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee that went cold, staring at the dark rectangle of the window. Every time the house creaked, my muscles tensed. Every time the wind hit the porch, I pictured something moving out there slowly, patient, waiting for me to blink. In the morning, I took a shovel to the field. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I expected nothing and was hoping I'd feel stupid afterward. Maybe I was hoping I'd dig up a buried barrel or an old stump, something that explained why animals had gathered and died there. I think part of me wanted to find something ordinary just so I could tell myself I hadn't ruined my life by coming here. I walked to the center of the circle. The soil looked normal. Dark, damp, rich. My corn leaves rustled around me, too tall for their age, brushing my jacket as if they were reaching. I started digging. After about 20 minutes, the shovel hit something that wasn't soil. A dull thud. Not rock, not wood. I dropped to my knees and scraped dirt away with my hands. And then I saw hair. I cleared more. A face emerged from the soil like it had been sleeping in it. It was a woman. She was wrapped in corn leaves. Not just covered. Wrapped. Woven around her body like someone had braided them with purpose. The same corn that had grown too fast in a field that hadn't grown anything in 15 years. She looked like she was asleep, except she wasn't breathing. And her skin had that dull, earthen color, like the ground had been holding her too long. Her hands were folded across her chest, and she was smiling. Not a slack face, not a peaceful expression. A smile like she'd seen something she'd been waiting for. I remember my own hands shaking so badly that dirt fell off them in little clumps. Then I noticed her jacket. It still had a Target tag on the sleeve. That detail hit me harder than the body itself, because it made her modern and real. Not a decades-old skeleton from some forgotten crime. Someone who had been shopping at Target. Someone who had lived in the same world as me recently, enough for that tag to still be there. I backed away from the hole until I fell onto my butt in the dirt. I think I said no out loud. I'm not sure. The police came. They taped off the field. They asked me questions for hours. Where was I from? When did I move in? Did I know her? Did I have visitors? Did I have enemas? Did I hear anything at night? Did I see vehicles? Did I have security cameras? I answered everything as best I could, and the whole time I kept thinking about the white trail camera footage and the moving silence and the marks in the soil, And I didn't say any of it because I didn't want to sound crazy. I didn't want to be the out-of-town guy who bought a farm and started talking about signs and remembering ground. In the end, they told me to stay in the county while they investigated. That was 6 days ago. They haven't told me who she is. They haven't told me how long she'd been down there. They haven't told me anything that would let my brain close the file and label it. What they don't know, because I didn't tell them, is what I did last night. I couldn't sleep again, so I went back through my trail camera footage from the start. Not just the night with the white section, all of it. Every clip since I planted the east field. I watched the early nights where nothing happened. The corn seedlings barely visible in the dark. The wind moving the stalks. The occasional rabbit hopping through. Normal stuff. Then I found the very first recording. The night after I planted the east field. Before I found the marks. Before the corn shot up. Before the silence started moving. Before the animals died. At 3 a.m., there's a moment where the camera shifts slightly. Just a degree. Like something nudged the post or brushed past it. It's subtle, but it's there. And in the corner of the frame, barely visible, partly blocked by darkness and blowing snow, is a hand, pressed flat against the soil, from underneath. I rewound it again and again until my eyes burned. I paused it, frame by frame, and it stayed there for those few seconds, palm against dirt like someone trapped below ground was pushing up to feel the world above. Then it was gone, and the camera angle steadied like nothing happened. After that, I sat at my kitchen table until sunrise with every light on in the house, listening to the wind hit the walls. I told myself I was done with the east field. I told myself I wasn't going back out there. I told myself I'd leave if I had to, even if it meant throwing away everything I'd just built. But I don't think it matters what I tell myself anymore. This morning I found the marks again, not in the field. On the wood of my porch steps, carved deep, the same clean cuts, the same pattern, like someone had taken a knife to the boards while I slept. I recognized them immediately. My stomach turned over. They weren't there yesterday. I stood on the porch staring at them, and the farmhouse smell seemed stronger. That buried scent I couldn't name, like the house was breathing it out. I took out my phone to photograph them, and my hands trembled so badly I almost dropped it. I tried calling Earl. No answer. I tried again. Straight to voicemail. Update. Because people keep asking, yes, I have photos of the symbols. I've tried uploading them. I've tried texting them. I've tried emailing them to myself. Every time I open that folder on my phone, the screen freezes. Just that folder. Everything else works fine. I'm going to keep trying because I know how this sounds without proof. But Earl won't pick up, and I don't think he's going to. And the more I stare at those marks on my porch, the more I get the feeling that the field wasn't the only place that remembered. It found a way to bring the memory to my door. Story 5. It happened less than 24 hours ago. My girlfriend and I decided to take a short walk in the forest preserve near her town, mostly because the weather had finally started to turn. After weeks of cold, the air felt softer, like the world was opening back up. We weren't planning anything intense, just an easy walk before dinner, something simple to end the day. The trail starts in an open field that's wide and uneven, with low hills that make the ground roll like waves. From the top of one of those hills, you can see a handful of houses off in the distance, not far enough away to feel isolated, but far enough that you don't feel like anyone is watching you. When we started walking, the sun was already beginning to dip. The sky had that perfect early evening look, soft pink and pale blue, almost like watercolor. It was the kind of sunset that makes you slow down without meaning to, just to take it in. For a few minutes, everything felt safe and light. The open field helped with that. You can see for a long way in every direction, and that does something to your brain. It tells you you're not trapped. It tells you if something's coming, you'll see it. But the trail doesn't stay in the field. It cuts straight into the woods, and the change is immediate. 1 minute, you're under that huge painted sky, and the next minute, you're under a roof of trees that blocks most of the remaining light. The comfort of those soft sunset colors disappears as soon as you step under the canopy. It felt like we walked out of a friendly world and into a quieter one that didn't care we were there. The trees were still mostly bare, just starting to grow leaves. The branches were thin and tangled overhead, so the last bits of sunlight came through in broken pieces. The trunks were tall and straight, and what struck me right away was how clean everything looked. No obvious damage. No twisted roots rising up like they were trying to grab an ankle. No low branches in our faces. The woods looked almost too neat, like it had been arranged. We kept walking anyway. We were talking like we always do, letting the conversation drift from one thing to the next. Work, family, little complaints, small jokes. The normal stuff couples talk about when they're relaxed. Then my girlfriend stopped so suddenly I almost bumped into her. She made a small sound, half disgust and half confusion, and her eyes locked onto the ground like she'd stepped on something. I followed her gaze, expecting maybe a pile of animal droppings or a bit of trash. Instead, I saw a lump in the middle of the trail. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. Then my brain caught up, and I realized it was a dead squirrel. That shouldn't have been a big deal. You see dead animals sometimes, especially in a forest preserve. But something about this squirrel was wrong in a way I can't fully explain, without sounding dramatic. It didn't look like it had simply died. It looked drained. The body was shriveled in on itself, like something had pulled the life out and left the shell behind. The teeth were still visible, sharp and almost fang-like in that way squirrels can look when their lips pull back. Its eyes were sunken, and the strangest part was the color. It was black. Not dark fur black, not shadow makes it look darker black. It was a flat, uniform blackness from head to tail, like it had been dipped in ink. There wasn't any normal variation, no lighter tones on the belly, no soft brown or gray hidden in the folds of the limbs. Just black everywhere. The same way char is black. It also didn't look like it had been there long. There was no decay, no swelling, no tearing, no blood, no obvious injury, and there were no bugs. That detail hit me hard because bugs had been bothering me the whole walk. I'd been getting bit enough to keep brushing at my arms. But around that squirrel, there was nothing. No flies hovering. No ants. No sign that the forest was interested in it at all. There was no smell either. No sour death smell, no rot. Nothing that would make you wrinkle your nose. It was like the body wasn't part of the normal cycle. Like it didn't register as food. We stood there for a few seconds too long. staring down at it, both of us quiet. The woods around us felt suddenly still, like the usual background noise had dropped. I became aware of how little wind there was, how the trees weren't moving much, how our breathing sounded louder. My girlfriend finally spoke, and her voice sounded tight. She said she felt a hot vibration move through her whole body, from the top of her head all the way down to her toes. She described it like electricity, like every nerve ending had lit up at once. I didn't feel heat. What I felt was pressure. It started in my chest like someone had tightened a strap around it. Then it spread into my shoulders and down into my arms and legs. Every joint in my body went tense at the same time, like my muscles were bracing for impact. It was so sudden and physical that for a moment I wondered if something was wrong with me, like a delayed pain from getting hit or falling earlier in the day. But it wasn't random. It matched the moment we noticed the squirrel. We didn't debate it. We didn't do that thing where one person says, "It's fine," and the other tries to ignore their gut. We've always agreed that intuition matters. When your body tells you something is wrong, it's not always worth proving it. We turned around. We hadn't even walked a mile in. The car wasn't far. That should have been reassuring. But the second we changed direction, the trail felt different. The woods felt less like a place we were strolling through, and more like a place we were leaving. At first, we walked fast, but still tried to keep it casual, like if we acted normal, nothing could attach itself to us. We didn't say much. Our conversation died without either of us choosing to stop. It was like talking suddenly felt inappropriate, like noise would draw attention. We'd gone maybe a few minutes back when my girlfriend turned her head slightly and asked quietly, "Did you hear that?" I stopped immediately and listened. At first I heard nothing but normal forest sounds, the faint rustle of branches, our own breathing, the soft crunch of our shoes on dirt and old leaves. Then, just at the edge of hearing, there was something else. So faint I could have missed it if she hadn't said anything. A sound that didn't belong to the woods. A voice. My girlfriend's eyes widened as she listened harder. She said it sounded like a woman screaming, "Help me!" That word landed in my stomach like a stone. Help me isn't a sound you want to hear in a forest at sunset. Not when you're alone, not when the light is fading fast, not when your instincts are already warning you. We stood there for a beat, both of us trying to decide if we'd actually heard it or if our minds were turning shadows into threats. Then we kept walking, faster. The sun was dropping quickly now. That last soft light was draining out of the sky, and the forest got darker in a way that felt like a door closing. We didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other much. The only goal was to get back to the open field and then to the car. After another minute or two, I heard it too. It wasn't loud. It wasn't clear. But it was there, and once I heard it, I couldn't unhear it. A woman's voice, strained and urgent, calling for help. The scary part wasn't just that it was happening. The scary part was what it did next. As we kept walking, the screams sounded farther away. That should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It didn't make sense. If someone was out there in the woods screaming for help, and we were walking away from the sound, yes, it would get quieter. But this wasn't a slow fading. It was like the distance changed too quickly, like whoever was screaming had been moved. It went from somewhere nearby to way off in the distance in a way that didn't match the pace of our steps. My mind tried to come up with explanations. Maybe the sound was bouncing oddly through the trees. Maybe it was coming from a road on the other side of the preserve and we were shifting angle. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe teenagers were messing around with someone's fear. Maybe it was a recording. But the sound didn't behave like normal sound. It kept retreating like it was being pulled away, and yet the tone of the scream didn't change like a person running out of breath. It stayed sharp, urgent, and steady. Then a thought hit me so hard I almost stopped walking, because I'd heard something like that before. Not in real life, but in stories I grew up with. The kind of stories adults tell kids to scare them into coming home before dark. I didn't want to say it out loud. Saying things gives them shape. It makes them more real. But the fear in my chest made the words push up anyway. I told my girlfriend we needed to get out. Not soon. Not in a few minutes. Now. I didn't fully explain yet. I just kept us moving. We reached the edge of the forest and stepped back into the open field right as the sun hit that moment before disappearing completely. When the light shifts and everything looks briefly greenish and unreal, the sky was darkening fast. The pastel colors gone, replaced by a deep blue that made the field feel exposed. And as soon as we crossed out from under the trees, the scream stopped. Not faded, not slowly quieted. Stopped. Like someone flipped a switch. We both paused, looking back at the tree line. The woods stood there like a wall. From the outside, it looked calm and ordinary again. That's when I finally explained the thought that had dropped into my mind like ice water. I grew up hearing Filipino stories, urban legends, warnings, things you're told not because someone expects them to be literal, but because they get under your skin and stay there. There are different versions depending on who tells it, but one of the most famous creatures is an aswang. Some people call it a manananggal. Some call it a tik-tik. The details change from story to story, but the core idea is always the same. It looks normal in the day. It can pass for human. It can disguise itself as an animal. Dog, cat, something ordinary you'd never think twice about. But at dusk, it changes. It becomes something that feeds, something that takes. And the detail that came to me while we were walking out, the one I couldn't shake, is something I was told as a kid. With certain creatures like that, the sound is backwards. The farther away it seems, the closer it actually is. The closer it seems, the farther it actually is. It's a trick that keeps you confused until it's too late. So when we heard a woman screaming for help and the sound started pulling away from us too quickly, when it kept sounding farther and farther while every part of my body felt tighter and more watched, I couldn't stop my brain from snapping those old stories into place. I looked at my girlfriend in the fading light and told her what I was thinking. I told her about the way those stories describe something that doesn't just kill, something that drains, something that leaves things empty. And I told her that the dead squirrel, black, dried out, untouched by bugs, smelling like nothing, didn't feel like a normal death in the woods. It felt like the aftermath of feeding. We got to the car and didn't waste time. We got in, locked the doors, and drove off. Only when the preserve was behind us and the streetlights started showing up again did my chest finally loosen a little. But even then, the calm didn't fully return. Because the part that keeps repeating in my mind isn't just the squirrel, or even the screaming. It's the way the sound behaved, like it was meant to guide us. Not toward it, not away from it, just to keep us moving, keep us unsure, keep us listening. And the truth is, I don't know what we heard. Maybe it was a person. Maybe it was an animal that sounded human. Maybe it was someone messing around with a recording. Maybe it was nothing more than sound bending through trees at the wrong time of day. But I do know what my body felt. I know what my girlfriend felt. And I know how fast both of us agreed to leave without even having to say the full reason. It's easy to laugh at old legends in daylight. It's harder when the sun is dropping. The woods turn into a silhouette. You find something that looks drained instead of dead, and a voice calls for help from somewhere you can't see, only for it to sound farther away the faster you try to leave.